Question is to the Prime Minister. Does he agree with his Minister for Economic Development statement yesterday that the current weekly income gap between New Zealand and Australian full-time workers is, quote, certainly a lot less than it was when Labor was in office, end quote?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes, and if the member... I thank the member for asking, actually, because I'm advised that the gap between gross average weekly earnings in Australia and New Zealand, adjusted for purchasing power parity, is currently $160.25, and that is certainly a lot less than it was in 2005, where it was $187.60.
Order.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, why is he and his Minister for Economic Development spreading that misinformation when, since the election, the Australian Bureau of Statistics and Statistics New Zealand show that the gap between average weekly earnings in Australia and New Zealand has grown by more than $50 a week in Australia's favour?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, because it's not a straightforward matter and one can use a number of data series depending on whatever one you want. But if I refer to the data series I'm using, which is the most comparable one between New Zealand's gross average weekly earnings, I might add that not only is the wage gap smaller now than it was in 2003, but it is smaller than it was in 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007. Thank goodness we've got a government with an economic plan to keep closing that gap.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Order. Before I call the Honourable Member, I'd ask just for the noise to be a little more reasonable on both sides. While the Prime Minister is answering the question, I'm struggling to hear the answer, and since the question's been asked, I'm sure the answer is important. And likewise, when the members of the government side need to be a little more reasonable too. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I seek leave of the House to table a compilation of figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and Statistics New Zealand showing that the wage gap for average weekly earnings has blown out by more than $50 a week. Mr Speaker, to clarify for the Minister, this was prepared by the New Zealand Parliamentary Library.
Leave is sought to table that document. Is there any objection? There is no objection.
Mr Speaker, supplementary question. Mr Speaker, if the Prime Minister was so confident in his own figures, why has he moved from saying before the election that the fundamental purpose of his government would be to close the wage gap to more recently simply describing that goal as aspirational?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, well, they're one and the same thing, but Mr Speaker, now that the member's asked me that question, let me run through just one or two things that form part of the economic plan that will close the gap with Australia.
Point of order.
RMA reforms, tax cuts, infrastructure spending...
Point of order.
The Prime Minister has clearly signalled that he's not going to answer the question, but to go off on his own tangent. I would ask you to bring him back to answering the question.
Now, order. The House is a bit excited over this issue, and I can understand that, but members must obey the standing orders. I think, in fairness, the Prime Minister, the question didn't really invite the Prime Minister to go through the list of policies he believes are going to do that. But I invite, if the Honourable Leader of the Opposition has another supplementary question, you may ask it.
Well, point of order, Mr Speaker. I'm still waiting to hear the answer to the last question, which you said that the Prime Minister hadn't answered.
Order. Well, order. I thought the Prime Minister did answer it, but then went on to give further information, and I can't ask him to answer it exactly the way the Leader of the Opposition may like, but I think, having stopped him from giving further information, I think a further question is now required.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. What does the Prime Minister say to his predecessor and former National leader, Don Brash, when he said on The Nation last weekend that New Zealand would not catch up with Australia on the National Government's, quote, present track? And what would he say to Alan Bollard, the Governor of the Reserve Bank, who said that National's posturing in this way is unrealistic?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I'd say National has an economic plan and involves cutting taxes, building more infrastructure, lifting skills, reforming the RMA, more money for science and innovation, expanding our free trade policy, getting on top of the size of government, focusing on frontline services, looking at labour market reform and having an absolutely brilliant Minister of Finance to guide us through it. All of that will help catch Australia.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Why would the average New Zealand worker believe that he or she was going to be better off when the statistics show clearly that on average weekly earnings the gap has blown out by $50 a week, when from the 1st of October they'll be paying 50% more on their consumption tax because he's pushed up GST, contrary to his promise, and when for workers on the average wage and below, actually they'll still be paying more income tax than their Australian equivalents?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I say exactly the same thing. If the Labor Party wants to reverse $4 billion worth of personal tax cuts that come in and help New Zealanders on 1 October, go ahead and campaign on it.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question. Well, actually, a point of order again, Mr. Speaker.
Order.
Point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'd invite you to examine the Prime Minister's answer and whether he made any attempt to answer that question.
Order. Order. No, there won't be any comments while the Speaker's on his feet. Unfortunately, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition should just go back over the question he asked. And certainly asked a question, but then he added a number of statements, one of which the Prime Minister picked up on. One of the statements related to people being worse off because of the tax changes, and or not being better off because of the tax changes. And the Prime Minister picked up on that part of the question and answered it, which he's entitled to do.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how does it...
Order.
Mr. Speaker,
the Leader of the Opposition.
How does he account for the fact that not only since November 2008 has the wage gap for those on average earnings increased by more than $50 a week, but those same statistics from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and Statistics New Zealand show that for the last quarter the rise in Australian wages was 5 times that of the rise in New Zealand workers' wages?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, that's one data series, and whether it's right or not, we'd have to go and look at it. But on the data series I'm looking at, Mr. Speaker, the wage gap has narrowed not only compared to 2003, but compared to 2004, 2005, 2006 and 2007. And, Mr. Speaker, it took 9 years for them to make a complete and utter mess of the economy. It might take a bit longer for us to sort it out.
The Honourable Sir Roger Douglas.
Mr. Speaker, is the Prime Minister concerned that New Zealand's labour productivity growth of 3% between 1992 and 2000, which exceeded Australia, then fell in New Zealand under the period of a Labor-led government to a mere 0.9%, well below Australia? And if so, isn't the lesson we should learn from this is that if you destroy incentives by high taxes, poorly designed expenditure policies, excessive regulation and ever larger government spending, then you undermine the very basis of higher income for working New Zealanders?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the member makes a very good point that if you want higher wages in New Zealand, then fundamentally we have to have greater levels of productivity. And that's one of the reasons why the government is very focused on moving New Zealand into higher levels of income production so that we can earn more. Mr. Speaker, I might also add that after 9 years of a national government, the gap between New Zealand and Australia was $117, and by 2005 it was $187, which just shows you how much damage that government did when it was in office for 9 years and what poor economic managers they were.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, why doesn't the Prime Minister simply come clean and admit to New Zealanders that far from closing the wage gap with Australia, he's actually made it worse?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, one, because I haven't, and secondly, at least I understand what I'm doing. That member doesn't know whether he's raising GST, lowering GST or taking it off everything from food to hamburgers. That member hasn't come up with one policy in the entire time he's been Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Sir Roger Douglas.
Mr. Speaker, does the